Hi, guys, and welcome to another episode of Marketing the Madness, where I guide you through the marketing madness to make sure that your business or brand gets further faster. And today, it's not actually story time with Katie. It's actually going to be story time with the amazing author of this book, Richard Shotton. I actually discovered Richard many, many years ago through a book that he authored called The Choice Factory. But today, he's going to be sharing some insights from his latest book called Hacking the Human Mind. Here it is. I absolutely love it. And it uncovers how 17 of the world's biggest brands have got so big. And you are going to be able to learn all the tricks, all the insights that you need to get your business further when it comes to behavioural science and marketing your business. So hello, Richard. It feels kind of surreal sometimes me sat chatting to you because I have been such a fan of your work, your books. So I feel incredibly privileged to have you here today.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, and your brain is amazing. I feel like I'm going to be able to hack your mind today. So, of course, we're going to be talking about your recent book, Hacking the Human Mind. But before we do that, what I'd like to do is just set the scene for all the lovely marketeers, tech, amazing brains listening. Why is behavioural science important for marketers?
Because all marketers are in the business of behaviour change. Like, if you think about the core challenges that a marketeer faces, getting people to switch from a competitor brands, paying more for their products, using more of a portfolio of products, these are all questions of behaviour change. We're trying to get people to do something different. That's the fundamentals of marketing. And all behavioural sciences it's the study of what makes for effective behaviour change. So the question really is, if you're a marketer, if you're in the business of behaviour change, why wouldn't you use 130 years of study into what makes for effective behaviour change?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gutted that I didn't study sociology, psychology, all the things my daughter's actually studying now, because I find it so interesting. If I'd lived life again, I think that grounding knowledge for me as a marketeer, it comes to me fairly naturally a lot of the time, and I get to read lovely books from fantastic people like you. But tell me about your career, Richard. How did you start your career? I mean, I have done, obviously, because I'm a fan, I've been stalking you. Not don't worry, not totally. But yeah, tell me about your interest in this, where it came from.
So I stumbled into behavioural science. I'd always been interested in why people do the things they do. So I'd gone into this career in marketing, media planning specifically. But it wasn't until about 2004 that I came across behavioural science. And it happened that one of our existing clients, the NHS, had a brief that we needed to encourage people to give more blood. And I just happened to be reading The Tipping Point at the same time as getting that brief in. And at the very back of Malcolm Gladwell's book, he talks quite briefly about two American psychologists called Latané and Darley. And they came up with this idea in the 60s called the bystander effect. And essentially, that's the argument that if you ask lots of people for help, there is a diffusion of responsibility. Every individual leaves it up to other people. The individual thinks themselves, well, I know lots of other people have been asked, why don't I let someone else go through the hassle of helping? So when I read that, I thought, bloody hell, this is exactly the problem we're facing in the blood service. We're going out and saying blood stocks are low in England and Wales. And just as Latané and Darley suggest, most people are ignoring us. Most people are leaving it up to their neighbour. So went and spoke to the creative agency. There's a brilliant planner down there called Charlie Snow. And we said, well, why don't we apply this principle? And why don't we test, rather than saying blood stocks low in England and Wales, why don't we micro-target? As much as you could do in 2004. So we started saying, blood stocks are low in Basildon, or blood stocks are low in Brentwood or Harlow. We targeted the message to a much smaller group to try and create this sense of personal responsibility. Now, that was a very crude application of a very well-known bias. But within a week or two, saw the impact. There was this 10 or 15% improvement in response rates. And that essentially got me hooked. I thought, well, if this one study applied, just by chance to a brief, if it can have this positive effect, what else is there out there? And I was kind of blown away slightly that there were thousands upon thousands of studies run in rigorous controlled conditions, which to me seemed to solve lots of public health problems or commercial problems. Yet at the time in the agency, literally no one was talking about psychology. When I started to raise behavioural science as an opportunity, I can remember literally people laughing in my face saying, why would you want to use a study from the 1960s? These academics, they're ivory tower, they don't know what they're talking about. We're in the hard-nosed world of commercial business. What could this possibly help us? But actually, over time, I saw again and again that if you took the right principle from the academic work and applied it with a little bit of creativity, you could get amazing effects.
How many different principles do you think there are?
Oh my God.
I told you I was going to go off brief on this podcast. Because there's obviously 17.
Well, in the book, there are 17 brands.
Yes.
And then for each of the brands, we probably talk about on average about two behavioural science principles. So there's probably 30 or 40 biases we cover in there. I think it's very hard to give an exact number because it's like saying how many colours are there? Where do you say that green becomes blue? I mean, there are lots of subdivisions. But, people have certainly put, behavioural science lists together and there will be 200, 300, 400 different sets of biases. So it's a massive field. I mean, the first studies were done back in the 1890s. There's 130 years of experimentation into what makes people tick, what influences people. So it's a huge, huge field. You spend your whole life thinking about it and working on it.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the brands in here I am a big fan of, so I'm really interested to delve into a few. In fact, one I've had on the podcast, so we're going to talk about them, Guinness.
Yeah.
Before we do that, though, I'm going to share a story back at you because I don't think people realise how important this truly is when they're coming up with ideas, but it's something that I have naturally been around because I've had fantastic creative directors or people that I've worked with, and had a very similar thing that really piqued my interest a few years ago, well, quite a few years ago, probably about 12, 15 years ago. And actually that was, we'd had a brief from, similar to your brief, this is what made me think of it, from the Lawn Tennis Association, which was, we need to create a new digital platform. Our big aim is to get more people playing tennis. And their whole strategy that they came to us with the brief was, we need to show, we want to show all the inspiring celebrities. We want to to get more people across the country playing tennis. And I can't remember what the strapline was now, like get into tennis or whatever it was. Obviously built around Wimbledon and all the amazing, fantastic people that are brilliant at playing tennis. They were like, we want these really inspiring images all over the website. And the creative director that I worked in the pitch teams. I'd lead the pitch from a new biz. I'd be the one kind of orchestrating it, helping come up with the ideas, but obviously with lots of really amazing people around me. And we started to do some research, and we would always actually get people in to kind of test the different theories and the different images and the different treatments and things. And of course, what the Lawn Tennis Association wanted, sorry for anyone who's listening from the Lawn Tennis Association, was totally wrong. That made people feel, when we did all of the testing with, the people that they wanted to get into tennis, that made them feel intimidated. They weren't good enough. It wasn't inspiring for them. It was like, oh my God, no, that's exactly why I'm not going to go, because everyone's going to laugh at me. And I even feel like that about, there's the paddle reunion at the moment, isn't there? Paddle everyone seems to be playing it. And actually, what they wanted is to see families, people that weren't very good, playing a much softer, less glamorous side of tennis. And that's what ended up being launched on the website.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah. But a really basic bit of, human behavior, understanding how humans think. And I think from a marketing perspective, a lot of the time we think it's this glossy OTT thing that it needs to be, and that's always the answer. The gloss, the perfection is the answer. But I think what your book and what behavioural science proves is often, as hopefully my example proves a little bit, that's the opposite.
Yeah, and I'll argue the useful thing with behavioural science is there are many, many different ways to solve a brief. And I think too often we rely on gut feel and hearsay and what we think should work. The brilliant thing about behavioural science is lots of these interventions have been tested, and the core of behavioural science is which of those interventions that seemed reasonably sensible, which have been proven to work in experimental conditions. So if you take inspiration from this body of work that has been proven to work in other situations, I think you've just got a better chance of success. So that's what the book's trying to do. It's looking at 17 super successful brands, and then of all the things those brands did, what are the 2 or 3 tactics that have also been proven to work in peer-reviewed, controlled conditions?
That we can steal and go and do
Yeah,
ourselves.
exactly. Yeah.
Innovation is, what does someone, I can't remember, I think I Googled this once and it was like, what does innovation mean? And it was like, it's the best version of copying or something like that. But I mean, it's not copying. You're learning from some of the world's best in this book. And I think for me already, I'm like, oh yeah, we kind of do some of that. But if I can bring some of these ideas into our campaigns are going to deliver so much better for our clients.
And it's not just taking randomly from what an Apple or a Starbucks did, because any complex brand does thousands of things, often concurrently. And some of those interventions will attribute more to the success. Some will be neutral, some will probably detract. All a successful brand is a mix, which is generally successful things. What the book tries to do is weed out which of the interventions genuinely helped by looking at which of those interventions have also been shown to work in experimental conditions. So it should expedite success.
Yeah, I love it. Well, I've already learned a lot just on my train ride up, really delving into, I think I read chapter 9 for Guinness, which is on page 99, which I don't know if you did that on purpose or by accident.
Let's pretend we did.
But that's the one that I chose, and that's the one that we're going to talk about. So Guinness have got an interesting story. Do you want to talk to me about the behavioural, what am I even saying this right? The behavioural bias, that's the word I'm looking for, isn't it? So the behavioural bias that they have played into with a lot of their marketing tactics. Because they had, I can't remember, was it 170 years? So a 260-year-old brand, but for 170 years, they did no advertising. So when they did, it got quite interesting.
Yes, that they always made the point of, we're only going to advertise when we've got something to say that's as high quality as the brand. I think that was their mantra. But the book focuses on, one particular campaign, which is an AMV campaign where they came up with this amazing line, "Good things come to those who wait." And the brilliance there is that they lean into a supposed flaw of the product rather than trying to brush it under the carpet. And the flaw of Guinness is that you have to wait. Most people before that campaign got irritated at the bar. The lager drinkers would get served immediately. The Guinness drinker had to wait almost 2 minutes to get their pint. And what was so brilliant about AMV's response, and especially the work of a creative director called Walter Campbell, was even though the brief specified that they weren't to mention the wait, that this was a really negative thing, they thought that was something that should be front and centre of the advertising. So they came up with this amazing line, "Good things come to those who wait." Now, the behavioural science principle behind that is something called the Pratfall Effect. So it's an idea from 1966. The original academic was a Harvard psychologist called Elliot Aronson. And in 1966, he comes up with this idea that if you admit a flaw, you become more appealing. So for the original study, he recruits a colleague. He gets that colleague to take part in a quiz. Aronson has given that contestant all the questions beforehand. So the guy does amazingly well. The contestant does brilliantly, gets 92% of the questions right, wins the quiz by miles, looks like an absolute genius. But then as the quiz is coming to a close, he makes a small blunder, what an American would call a pratfall in the 60s. He spills his coffee down himself. Now, Aronson has recorded all of this, and he takes the recording, he plays it to listeners, but he plays the listeners one of 2 versions. So some listeners hear the entire incident, great performance and spillage. Other listeners hear an edited version where the spillage is removed, they just hear the amazing quiz performance. Everyone is then questioned as to their feelings towards the contestant. And what Aronson finds is that the listeners or the group that listen to the mistake and the performance, they rate their contestant 45% more appealing versus the group who just heard the amazing quiz performance. So Aronson calls this the Pratfall Effect. And it's essentially the idea that if you emphasize a flaw, you become more appealing. And I think that, and there are lots of other reasons why it works so well, which we'll maybe delve into, but that I think is fundamental to the success of Guinness. It's this rare use of a really powerful bias that boosts appeal. And then I think on top of that appeal, it's distinctive. Most adverts brag. So if you admit a flaw, you're standing out, you can get noticed straight away. And if you admit a weakness in your product, you have tangibly proved your honesty. Everything else you say becomes that more believable. So if you admit you're slow, people are more likely to believe that you're high quality. So I think it's one of the best ever lines written in advertising.
Yeah, I think going back to what we were talking about earlier, it builds that trust, doesn't it? Because like you say, you're being honest. Like, we're not good at being fast, we're slow, but that's because of the quality of the product that we're creating. And you should, good things do come to those who wait. And that's why you need to wait.
Yeah, trust is absolutely part of it. And this is where one bias kind of almost blends into another. There is a separately named bias called the stolen thunder effect. And the original research was done by Kipling Williams at the University of Toledo. And he runs an experiment where he gets people to read through mock trials. So you hear the defendant's or the defense lawyer's argument, and then you hear the prosecution's. And he does a couple of different versions. First version, you hear the defense lawyer making a reasonably powerful case about why the defendant is innocent. And then you hear the prosecution who have a powerful critique of that defence. And that group say whether they think the defendant is guilty or not. Second group of people, they hear exactly the same content. So slightly flawed defence argument, then powerful critique. But there is an extra couple of sentences on the defence's part in which they admit there is a weakness in their case. They admit the problem that the prosecution then interrogates. The crucial thing to point out here is they just admit the flaw in their defence case. They don't in any way try and justify it or counterbalance it. They're not giving any information about why that flaw's not a genuine one. They just admit to it. And the group that read that set of defence and prosecution information, they're much more likely to think the defendant is innocent. Williams's argument is if you admit something that is not seemingly in your self-interest, it gives all your other arguments more credibility because you have shown that you're prepared to admit information that could be damaging. Everything else you say has greater credibility. So yeah, absolutely. I think it also, this line builds great trust and great believability.
I loved reading that bit because what I didn't say earlier, we were talking about our kids. My daughter is studying sociology, philosophy and English lit, but she's then going to go and do sociology and criminology because she wants to be, and then a law conversion because she wants to be a criminal defence barrister.
Yeah.
So I was reading that thinking, I need to get her to read this because that's such a good way. Like when I mean, she will because she's just one of those people that will. But like that's such a smart way to influence. Like it's trust is the new influence in my mind. And in a world, just to kind of go slightly off topic from the book, but I guess it is all relevant. In a world which is so, heavily, robots, basically AI. We were talking earlier, weren't we? Off camera, off sound, however you're listening, about how you've got bots on LinkedIn, like these commenting bots. Like so much is fake. So the things that stand out have to be real, and they've got to you've got to gain trust with them in some way. The principles in here all kind of. Not all, but a lot of them link back to it's human behaviour.
Absolutely. So I'm very much interested in how you take these principles and apply them in marketing. And marketing in its broadest sense could be website design, pricing, whatever. But if it was your daughter and she's interested in using these as a lawyer, you could take the same principles and just put a bit different spin on them. There's an amazing book by John Steele. I think he was head of planning at WPP, and it must be 15 years old now. It's called Perfect Pitch. And he opens with this long story about the O.J. Simpson trial.
Yeah.
So I'm in my 50s now, and I can remember that O.J. Simpson trial, absolutely huge case, got phenomenal publicity. And Steele dissects why the defence team was so powerful. So one of the things that they did was there were some police on the case who were undoubtedly racist. I think that's kind of beyond dispute. But what they needed to do was try and persuade the jury that all the police involved were kind of tarnished. And what they did amazingly was, rather than talking about corruption and racism and prejudice, which are very abstract things, they came up with a concrete bit of language to make their point. So what they famously said was, how many cockroaches do you need to find in a bowl of pasta before you'll stop eating it? What they're essentially trying to say is, how many individual policemen have to be racist before you say the whole department is? Now, you can argue about the logic of that statement, but what you can't dispute is it is a very powerful visual image. Now, what a behavioural scientist would say is that's absolutely brilliant. We are hardwired to remember concrete visualisable information much better than abstract information. So the original slightly flawed studies were done back in 1972 by Ian Begg at the University of Western Ontario. And probably 2020, Mike Trahan and I reran some of those studies with a much bigger nationally representative group of people. So what we did was give people a list of information. So we'd give them a list of, say, 10 words, 10 phrases. And we didn't mention this, but half of the phrases were concrete phrases, like fast car or cashew nut or skinny jeans. They were tangible physical items that you could visualize. And half of the phrases were abstract concepts, like innovative quality or trusted provenance. People read the list, we took the list away, and then a few minutes later, we asked people what they could remember. And people were slightly under 10 times more likely to remember the concrete visualizable phrases over the abstract ones. Now, the reason that happens is, according to Ian Begg, the guy who did the initial work, he says vision's the most powerful of our senses. So if you use language people can visualize, it's sticky. If you use abstract language, it's completely forgettable. So you go back to that court case. If you talked about on day 15, racism, prejudice, discrimination, people might be moved at the time, but on day 75, when the jury actually came to their conclusions, they wouldn't remember those points. You talk about a bowl of pasta with a cockroach in, that's something, I can remember 15 years later after reading Perfect Pitch. So your daughter could go through Hacking the Human Mind or any other book.
No, she only needs this one.
Perfect answer. And she could take the same principles that marketers used and I think become a more powerful lawyer by using those ideas.
Yeah. Well, we can all become more powerful, can't we? I think that's the thing. This is what I've really taken away from reading all of your books, is if you just spend a little bit more time thinking about the why, then the ideas that you come up with, whether you're a barrister or a marketer or whatever, are going to be a lot better because you're doing it for the right reason.
Yeah, and the great bit of behavioural science is, I completely agree with that statement, but I think lots of marketers would say, we really want to understand people. We really think customer insight is important. The why is massively important. But once you've set that as a goal, how the hell do you deliver on it? The brilliant thing with behavioural science is you've got this huge swathe of experiments that let you understand what the why is in different situations. So there's a wonderful practicality to behavioural science. Yes, it helps on this big abstract objective of understanding people, but also it gives you very, very simple tactical levers. Like next time you're writing an email, next time you're writing a print ad, or next time you're doing a presentation, think, how do I use language that people can visualize? That's something everyone can apply very, very simply.
Yeah, I love that. Are there, I mean, obviously you work with a lot of businesses to help them and their teams, get better at this stuff, to inspire them to use behavioral science in their day-to-day of running their business, I guess, a lot of the time in the marketing world. Are there any core principles that you think are particularly relevant right now in a world of AI and robots? That we have, human behavior is changing because of how we interact, because of social media, because ChatGPT has had a huge impact on how all of us search, find the products, services that we want, use, whatever it might be. Are there any, behavioral biases or particular strategies that you think are interesting right now?
Yes. So I think we could look at that 3 different ways. You could look at it of why behavioural science is important when supposedly AI will give you an answer, the kind of general level. You could look at, if you run a business, small or large, how do you get people being as effective as possible with this new technology? So almost you use behavioural science on your
That's
staff.
what I'm thinking, yeah.
And then the third one is, I think there are some very, very specific experiments about various principles that could be used. So if you start with the broadest one, why do you need behavioural science if AI gives you the answer? Well, the reason you need it is AI doesn't give you an answer, it gives you answers. It gives you as many answers as you have prompts. It will go on infinitely, or never tire. It will just keep on giving you more and more answers. So the point isn't, can AI give you the right answer? It's, can you select from what it tells you? And unless you have the right model of human nature in your mind, you're not going to pick the right answer from everything that AI gives you. So, and I'll just use this example because we've just been discussing it, but if you think convoluted, abstract language is what's needed, when you prompt AI to write a blog for you and it comes back with this seemingly basic, concrete language, you'll say to it, oh, no, make this sound fancier, make it more abstract. You'll keep on telling it to solve the wrong problem. So you have to have the right model of human behavior. Otherwise, AI will just get you to the wrong place quicker. So I think that's the first bit. The second bit was, okay, so we've got these amazing tools. How do we make sure that they have the impact that they can have? How do they live up to their potential? Well, already behavioural scientists are experimenting on how you get the most out of AI. So, for example, there's a brilliant Harvard Business School psychologist called Fabrizio Dell'Acqua. I think it was 2020. It's quite early days of AI. He runs this amazing study with recruitment consultants. So gets this big group of recruitment consultants, gives them thousands of CVs, and they're randomized. So one recruitment consultant will get 50, another will get a different 50. They have to find the candidates who have the necessary mathematical skills. So it is an objective, quantifiable task. He then randomizes the recruitment consultants to 3 groups. One does the task manually. One does the task with, and I can't remember his exact phrase, but what I would just call slightly lazily bad AI. So you have an AI helper that is quite good. And then the final group have a good AI helper. So you have a AI tool that's a bit more sophisticated, gets a better answer on its own. Now, when he looks at the results, sees a very clear pattern. So the people without AI, they do bloody awfully. They do very badly. They're the worst performing group. But the next worst performing group is the people that have the supposedly good AI. The best performing group are the people with what he's labelled bad AI. Now, his argument about why this happens is, he says, look, you've got this problem that as AI becomes better, people forget there is a role for themselves. Once you pass a certain threshold of effectiveness, a threshold of a decent answer, people start to think, well, the job's done. They just cut and paste the answer and think that's all that's needed. But what Dell'Acqua argues is the weaker AI that is obviously flawed. That's the ideal thing, because the staff that are using it recognise there is a role for their expertise and insight. So he has this amazing name for the paper. It's called Falling Asleep at the Wheel. And his essential argument is AI goes wrong when people think it is a standalone technology. But actually, to solve any problem, it's the overlap, the interplay between the humans who use it and the technology. Ethan Mollick says, we should think of AI as a co-intelligence. But it's only when there is an obvious flaw that people naturally think they need to be involved. So the output for any company isn't, I think, to stick with earlier versions of ChatGPT or whatever other system they're using. I think that would be a bit foolhardy. But what they need to recognise is unless they introduce counterbalancing measures, effectiveness will go down. What they need to keep on reiterating is that the staff must bring their expertise. They must bring their insight. They have responsibility for the output. They cannot outsource that. So in that one example, it's just a single experiment showing that actually behavioural science can help you when you are trying to embed these technologies into your company.
Well, I'm going to teach my ChatGPT everything that's in your book.
Well,
because then it will give me better ideas. Like, you can create custom GPTs, you can create, projects, which we do a lot for our clients. But like you say, there's so much. I don't expect ChatGPT to give me the answers. I give it a brief from my human brain that it then goes and creates. And the more I can teach it, the more I do teach it becomes an extension of my brain to a certain amount, because it can remember things that I just can't remember in terms of stats.
Yeah.
I would love to say that I could recite this back one day if I read it enough, but I probably won't. But I could teach the core principles that I think will help me and my clients the most to ChatGPT and ask it to use it when it's creating concepts, creative strategies for my clients, whatever it might be, campaign ideas, whatever it might be doing. So I think that's where people need to get smarter and use the right behavioural biases that are right for their business, that are right for their brand, because they won't all be right. If you're not slow, the example we've used for Guinness isn't going to work for you.
Yes.
Because you're going to have a different story. So you need to understand which biases could work for you, how to use them, and then deploy them.
So I completely agree with that, and I think that the kind of the way you put it was lovely. Essentially, positioning AI as a companion, not a replacement. The danger is the Delacqua study suggests people will naturally default to using it unthinkingly unless the company sets up the structures to counterbalance that.
Yeah. I wrote something down, actually. Oh, God, I'm going to have lost it now. So apologies for taking ages. But I wrote something down from reading the book that I thought was really, really... it was about people with thinking and the cat swimming.
There's two...
Sorry, that was really bad.
No. There are
You're going to help me.
Cat statements.
Yeah.
So... One didn't make in the book. One's just brilliant, because it's quite a lot of my...
but we had a whole cat branding at Marketing in the Madness, and when I was reading that, I was like, how weird is that?
That's very nice.
It was an accidental same colour brand, but then also as soon as I started reading the book, I was reading about cats, and I was like...
There are two anecdotes I like about cats and marketing. The first is a David Droga one where he says, everyone hates advertising until they lose their cat. And I've always loved that, because there's a lot of people that wag on about the lack of ethics in marketing and it's manipulative. But then you think that's just rubbish. It depends on what you are using these techniques or using marketing to do. Everyone wants to encourage other people to change their behavior, and it's not advertising or marketing or behavioral science that's the problem. It's the ends to which you use it. But that's another cat anecdote. The phrase I think you're referring to is a Daniel Kahneman one.
Yes.
And it gets to the very essence of what behavioural science is. So he famously said, thinking is to humans as swimming is to cats. They can do it, but they prefer not to. Now, Kahneman, who died last year at the age of 90, was a Nobel Prize winner back in 2002, probably the most influential behavioural scientist there's ever been. And when he makes that statement, he's not trying to be rude about people. He spent a lot of his career at Princeton. He dealt with the most intelligent people in the world. So Kahneman is completely aware people can think, they can come up with amazing ideas. But he's also aware that from an evolutionary perspective, thinking is a energy-intensive activity. And energy is a scarce resource. So over time, humans have evolved to ration deep considered thought. And for most situations, most of the time, we don't make laboured considered decisions. We make quick, snap, reflexive decisions. Now, the way that we make those snap decisions, like what lager to order in a pub or what shampoo to buy, the way that we make those snap decisions is to use what psychologists call heuristics, what we would just call rules of thumb. We've got this catalogue in our head of thousands of rules of thumb to make life easier. Like pick the middle option, pick the most popular one. The highest priced wine will be the tastiest. Lots and lots of rules of thumb. Now, the interesting thing with those rules of thumb is they are prone to biases. And essentially, if you know what those biases are, when you are designing an ad, when you are creating a product, you essentially can work with human nature rather than against it. And my argument in the book is that is always, always more effective than trying to work against human nature. So it's a lovely phrase from Daniel Kahneman, I think captures the very essence of behavioural science, why it's so useful.
Yeah, and why ChatGPT has been so widely adopted, because no one can be bothered to think anymore.
Yeah, that we are lazy. We are,
Yeah.
in the words of Susan Fiske, one of Kahneman's colleagues at Princeton. She says we're cognitive misers. It's part of human nature. It's what's allowed us to survive, this ability to get quick, fast decisions. So rather than rail against that and try and design products for how people should behave, it's far, far more effective to work with how people actually behave. Design for someone who is going to be put off by small bits of friction. Design for people who are going to make very fast decisions that aren't particularly paying attention. That's the way success lies.
My very last question before I let you go and enjoy the rest of another rainy day in London. One tip for someone who maybe hasn't been thinking about human behavior enough in their marketing strategies, go-to-market strategies, whatever it might be. One thing that they can go and do to make their strategies more aligned with how humans behave.
Keep it simple, I would say. I think, and I am equally to blame here, lots and lots of marketers, we're always interested in what's novel, what's new, what's exciting, what's cutting edge. And when I do talks at companies or conferences, often people say to me, what's the latest new finding that you've found that we should be interested in? And it's a fair enough question, but I think it approaches things the wrong direction. What people should be talking about is what are the findings that were discovered 100 years ago that are still relevant today? Because the stuff that was discovered a long, long time ago, firstly, it's more likely to be robust because there's been 50 or 100 years to prove that idea wrong. And if it hasn't happened yet, it's unlikely to be proven wrong. But then secondly, when a field comes into existence, the things that are experimented on first are the ones that have the largest effects because they're the easiest ones to recognize. So actually, if you want to have an impact on your business, rather than just looking clever, I would go and think, well, what are the experiments that have been around for eons, and then think about applying those. So stuff like social proof. The original experiments go back to the 1930s. We are phenomenally influenced by what other people do. So a core task of a marketer is, how do I make my product look like it's popular? You look at studies that try and rank the relative importance of different biases. Social proof always comes up very high. Another one that's been studied on for at least 50 years, the work of Stephen Workshaw back in the 70s, is this idea of scarcity. People want what they can't have. That's something that I think every marketer should be constantly thinking about. And then the final bias that may be a very old one that I think we ignore too much is this idea of friction. So it's the idea that we think the way to change behaviour is to motivate people to want our products. And of course that has an effect. But the argument from people like Richard Thaler and Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize winners in 2017 and 2002, their argument is we overestimate the impact of motivation. We underestimate the impact of making things easier. So rather than think, how do I get people to want my products? What you should think is, what are the blockages that are stopping people buying? And then go through your customer journey with a fine-tooth comb, identify even the smallest bits of friction and put more effort into removing them. And I think if you started with those 3 biases, those 3 insights, I think you'd get 90% of the way there.
Amazing. I'm going to start winning not just 70% of my deals, but 90% after listening to that. Richard, thank you so much. Guys, if you want to connect with Richard, I follow Richard on LinkedIn. His content is fantastic. He also has a fantastic podcast. But of course, also, you can find his book. Look at this, like nice little bit of advertising for you, Richard.
Thank you very much. And I should say so Choice Factor and Illusion of Choice, my first books.
Yes.
I wrote them on my own, but this one was written, co-authored. Yes, so yes. Michael Aaron Flicker and I wrote this one.
I was not going to try and say Michael Aaron's name,
Michael
but now I know. Now I say it. So thank you. But I'll pop the links to this book and your other 2 books in the show notes. But yeah, big thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me. Cheers.
Amazing.